The morning of March 21st, 1945, the sky above Okinawa was a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that seemed almost indifferent to the violence about to unfold on the ground. Sunlight struck the ridges with a cold, muted clarity, reflecting off the shattered terrain and expanse every scar left by artillery and aerial bombardment. In the jagged expanse near the Shuri Line, First Lieutenant Samuel "Sam" Hollingsworth crouched behind a low ridge, gripping the worn hilt of his M1 bayonet. Its steel blade, dulled by repeated use and sharpened countless times in the field, felt like an extension of his arm. Around him, the 72nd Marine Regiment had dug shallow foxholes, rough excavations barely deep enough to offer protection from incoming fire, yet enough to lend a fragile sense of security. The men worked in silence, each breath measured, each movement precise. They were soldiers who had seen months of attrition and had learned, in the harshest terms, that mistakes were often fatal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The approaching Japanese force, however, dwarfed any ordinary concern. 3,000 soldiers were advancing in dense, disciplined columns, their bayonets fixed and their faces a mixture of determination and exhaustion. They moved as if the hills themselves had bent to their will, yet in that apparent inevitability lay a subtle vulnerability. Cohesion could be shattered by boldness, by timing, by the human factor that war books often neglected. For the Marines, even the most seasoned among them, the sheer scale of the enemy advance was a test of nerve. Hollingsworth's eyes scanned the distance, noting the way sunlight glinted on the steel tips of their rifles, and he felt that familiar tension of anticipation mixed with the knowledge of mortal risk. Hollingsworth had already witnessed the toll exacted by the campaign. Weeks of relentless bombardment, naval, aerial, and artillery, had hollowed the ridges, stripping them of soil, vegetation, and any semblance of natural protection. What had once been rolling hills covered in Okinawan greenery now resembled moonscapes. Mud churned into ridges by shell craters, twisted remnants of barbed wire snagging on jagged roots, and fragmented concrete bunkers that had collapsed under the combined weight of Japanese counterfire and American artillery. Each day of combat had further eroded the men's endurance, yet it was not the physical exhaustion alone that burdened them. It was the knowledge that behind every corner and every shallow depression, a rifle or machine gun could end a life instantly. Rations were meager and carefully rationed. Each Marine had been allocated 1.5 cans of corned beef, a small loaf of hardtack, and roughly half a pint of water per day. The rations were sufficient to sustain life, but not strength. They were designed to keep bodies moving without promise of comfort or pleasure. Food became a calculation, a psychological exercise as much as a matter of sustenance. Soldiers ate slowly, savoring the metallic tang of canned meat, the hardness of the bread that cracked under pressure, knowing that each mouthful was a resource to be stretched across the next 24 hours. Water, scarce and precious, was rationed with a careful hand, each drop measured against thirst, exertion, and the unpredictable demands of combat. Hollingsworth checked his canteen frequently, the familiar weight a small comfort amid uncertainty. Ammunition was similarly accounted for with obsessive precision. Every round fired was precious, and every rifle, machine gun, and artillery piece represented a limited capacity to influence the tide of battle. Marines were drilled to conserve fire, to ensure that each burst, each aimed shot, was calculated to achieve maximum effect. The men had been trained in the fundamentals of marksmanship, in fire discipline, and in the coordination of overlapping fields of fire. These principles, while straightforward in training, were tested in the chaos of Okinawa, where smoke, debris, and dust often reduced visibility to mere feet. The practical realities of combat required not only skill but judgment, the ability to discern when to hold fire and when to unleash it, to measure risk and reward in a fraction of a second. Despite these hardships, morale remained unbroken. There was an understanding among the men, tacit yet pervasive, that survival depended as much on cohesion and discipline as on individual prowess. In moments of quiet, when artillery fire paused and the wind carried distant sounds of battle, conversations would drift to home, to family, to the lives that awaited beyond the Pacific. Letters written hastily by candlelight or scavenged paper were read and reread, small anchors in a storm of violence. Humor persisted in whispered jokes, in the cadence of shared tasks, in the camaraderie that bound men together when fear threatened to isolate them. This human network of trust, shared experience, and collective responsibility formed a psychological shield as vital as any foxhole or steel helmet. In the distance, the first stragglers of the Japanese assault emerged from the tree line, their banners fluttering like shadows in the wind. They moved with a discipline honed by years of training, each man acutely aware of the tactics instilled in him by commanders who valued cohesion and relentless advance over individual initiative. The banners, emblazoned with insignia of division and regiment, were both a symbol of organization and a psychological instrument, a visual assertion of inevitability meant to intimidate and disorient the defenders. Hollingsworth watched as the column advanced, noting the uniformity of their steps, the synchronization of their rifles as they swung through the air in preparation for the charge. The terrain itself played a crucial role in the psychology of the moment. The ridges, though scarred and battered, provided intermittent cover, while the gaps between craters and natural depressions created avenues for both movement and ambush. Hollingsworth understood that terrain could be both ally and enemy. It could conceal his movements, but it could also channel the Japanese assault into positions where firepower and preparation could be brought to bear. For the men of the 72nd Regiment, this duality demanded constant awareness, an attunement to the land that went beyond maps and doctrine. It required intuition born of training, observation, and experience. Hollingsworth's thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of artillery. Though muted by distance, the vibrations reverberated through the earth, a reminder that the battle was no longer a question of if, but of when. Each Marine adjusted his position, checking bayonet and rifle, eyes scanning the horizon for the first signs of movement. There was a shared understanding, unspoken yet palpable, that the coming minutes would test every skill, every ounce of courage, and every lesson learned in training. The Japanese assault drew closer, and with it the tension in the foxholes escalated. Sweat mingled with dust on the Marine's skin, muscles coiled in readiness, hearts beating with a combination of fear and anticipation. There was a surreal quality to the scene. The quiet before the storm, the juxtaposition of meticulous preparation against the unpredictable chaos that war inevitably brings. In these moments, the mental discipline of the soldiers was as crucial as their physical endurance. Each man rehearsed the sequence of action in his mind. Bayonet ready, trigger finger steady, eye on the nearest enemy, coordination with the men on either side, communication silent but absolute. Hollingsworth reflected on the nature of what they were about to face. Bayonet charges in modern warfare had become almost anachronistic, relics of a previous century when massed infantry could rely on close-quarter shock tactics. Yet here, on this ridge, with artillery and machine gun fire potentially constraining the Japanese advance, the bayonet remained a critical tool, a weapon of initiative, psychological disruption, and decisive engagement. The irony was not lost on him. The very doctrine that deemed such charges obsolete had failed to account for the unpredictable human element, the capacity for audacity to reshape the battlefield. The first shock of movement rippled through the trees. Shadows detached from the tree line, advancing across the scarred landscape. Hollingsworth tightened his grip, sensing the faint vibration of approaching footsteps, the rustle of uniforms brushing against debris, the barely audible hum of concentrated determination. The ridge, once passive and indifferent, seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if the ground itself recognized the imminence of action. Training, discipline, and morale would now be tested against sheer numerical force. The Marines knew that hesitation could be fatal, yet overcommitment could be equally destructive. Every decision carried weight, not just for themselves, but for the men on either side, for the structure of the defensive line, for the broader objectives of the campaign. In that tense interstice between preparation and execution, every sense was heightened. The smell of cordite in the air, the metallic tang of sweat, the distant echoes of prior bombardments, the irregularity of the wind, all became part of the operational calculus. Hollingsworth glanced at his men. Faces, etched with fatigue and resolve, met his gaze. Eyes wide yet focused, awaited direction. He took a slow breath, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down like the unrelenting sun. Then, with the subtle motion of a hand and the unspoken command that had been drilled into them for weeks, the Marines prepared to act. They understood that the next 12 minutes would define not only the battle for the ridge, but the narrative of courage, cohesion, and initiative that would be remembered long after the guns fell silent. In that suspended moment, as the first Japanese soldiers began to crest the rise, the paradox of war became starkly visible. 3,000 enemy combatants, advancing in disciplined mass, confronted by a regiment prepared, resolute, and willing to exploit every nuance of terrain, timing, and human psychology. The ridge, scarred and battered, had become a crucible. What unfolded in the coming minutes would not only defy conventional military expectation, but would— "Lieutenant," whispered Private Lewis, his voice tight with tension, "they're moving faster than we thought." Hollingsworth didn't respond. His eyes tracked the disciplined columns of Japanese infantry, noting the precision of their advance, the taut spring in their steps, the glint of bayonets reflecting the early sunlight. To any observer, the Japanese assault seemed unstoppable, a human wave propelled by doctrine, indoctrination, and desperation. For years, U.S. intelligence had studied these assaults, categorizing them as fanatical charges that would crumble under sustained fire. Yet the stories told at training camps had been abstract. Maps, statistics, predictions. Nothing could have prepared Hollingsworth for the tangible presence of 3,000 men moving as one entity, an unbroken tide of steel, flesh, and intent. The belief among the Marines before the engagement had been firm. The only feasible defense against such a force was coordinated artillery, machine guns, and careful fire discipline. Bayonet charges, in the doctrine of 1945, were considered a last resort, almost ceremonial in nature. The Marines' training manuals emphasized firepower and positioning. Closing with the enemy was the exception, not the rule. Yet as the enemy neared the ridge, the calculus of survival was about to shift in a way no manual could anticipate. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The American Marines, by contrast, were professional soldiers schooled in fire control, cover, and attrition tactics. They had been conditioned to believe that discipline and coordinated fire could overcome raw numbers. Equipment reinforced these beliefs. Each Marine carried a standard-issue M1 Garand rifle with 8 rounds in a clip and roughly 96 rounds of extra ammunition, along with grenades and the ever-present bayonet. Artillery was positioned behind the ridge,
but supply lines were stretched thin after weeks of continuous fighting. The Japanese attackers were lightly armed with Arisaka rifles, Type 98 grenades, and an array of mortars, but they carried no expectation of sustained engagement once pinned under disciplined fire. In the abstract, it seemed that the Marines' guns would decide the battle before any hand-to-hand engagement was necessary. Yet the reality of the terrain, the exhaustion of both sides, and the chaos inherent in battle would shatter that belief. For hours leading up to the assault, the Marines had observed the enemy's formations inch closer. The ridges provided little cover. Each second exposed them to sniper fire and incoming artillery. Morale was a fragile thing. Physical fatigue, hunger, and heat combined with the psychological pressure of impending annihilation. For the Japanese, years of indoctrination made them believe that numbers and aggression could overwhelm any obstacle, that courage alone could carry them through barbed wire, machine gun nests, and artillery barrages. The collision of these two doctrines, American fire discipline versus Japanese offensive zeal, was inevitable, and its resolution would produce a moment of stark, almost surreal irony. Lieutenant Hollingsworth, like many of his men, had trained extensively in small unit tactics. He knew the statistics. A well-placed machine gun nest could halt 100 attackers. Artillery could decimate formations in the open, and coordinated rifle fire could break enemy morale. And yet, watching the Japanese soldiers close in, he felt the same doubt that every human feels in the face of apparent inevitability. 3,000 men could not be stopped by a single ridge. 3,000 men could not be turned back by 80 exhausted, underfed, and outnumbered Marines. And yet, as the minutes ticked forward, something within the collective consciousness of the American troops began to crystallize. The situation demanded an action so audacious it bordered on the impossible. By 11:45, the Japanese were within 600 yards of the ridge. Artillery fire had slowed their advance, but their formations remained largely intact, their momentum unbroken. The Marines' fire discipline began to falter under the sheer weight of the approaching numbers. Officers shouted orders to conserve ammunition. Men adjusted sights and took careful aim, yet the psychological strain was palpable. Each Marine could feel the gap between doctrine and reality narrowing with every step of the enemy. It was in this moment that Hollingsworth made the decision that would define the battle. The bayonet charge, long considered a relic of outdated tactics, suddenly became the only option. It was a maneuver that, in theory, violated every principle of modern warfare. Standard military thought suggested that charging 3,000 men with only 100 rifles and bayonets was equivalent to suicide. Yet the terrain, the exhaustion of the enemy, and the surprise element created conditions under which the impossible could be attempted and perhaps even achieved. Before advancing, Hollingsworth called together his squad leaders. "Listen up," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "We're doing something no one thinks we can. Keep tight, trust your training, and trust each other. Once we move, we don't stop." The men nodded, faces grim, eyes hard. They had rehearsed bayonet drills countless times, but never under the pressure of facing a living, breathing enemy in such overwhelming numbers. Helmets tilted back, M1s fitted with bayonets, hands sweaty, they inched toward the slope. Every man knew the risk. Every man knew the potential for carnage. And yet, the collective will of the unit forged something stronger than fear, a shared belief that the only way to survive this moment was to embrace action, to turn doctrine on its head, to do the impossible. This was the foundation of belief, the context, the psychological tension, the preparation, and the doctrines that framed what was about to occur. From here, the collision with reality would follow, and in 12 minutes, a story would unfold that would become a legend not for its scale, but for the paradoxical combination of human resolve, tactical innovation, and sheer audacity. At 12 noon, the ridge fell silent for a heartbeat, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. Then, with a signal as subtle as a nod and as precise as a trained heartbeat, Lieutenant Hollingsworth gave the order. "Forward!" The Marines surged up the slope, bayonets glinting in the sun, rifles cradled like extensions of their arms. The enemy, 3,000 strong, had expected the predictable: suppression fire, artillery barrages, defensive entrenchments. They had not expected the Americans to leave their cover and close the distance in an organized, deliberate charge. In that instant, psychology became as lethal a weapon as steel. The first point of contact was brutal and instantaneous. Japanese soldiers, advancing in dense columns, were met by a wall of bayonets. The impact created shock waves, men knocked off balance, weapons clashing, cries of pain cutting through the midday heat. Yet, what was remarkable, and would later puzzle historians, was not the carnage alone, but the speed and cohesion of the Marine assault. Each squad moved in concert, every man supporting the other, keeping the line intact despite the ferocity of the Japanese counterattacks. Hollingsworth's men were trained for precision, for exploiting gaps in enemy formations. They had studied the tendencies of Japanese infantry, the ritualistic adherence to formation, the tendency to hesitate under unexpected aggression, and the psychological weight of sudden, close-range violence. Each bayonet thrust, each rifle butt strike was executed with surgical intent, creating openings that widened with every coordinated push. Within the first 3 minutes, the tide began to shift. The Japanese columns, disciplined and numerous though they were, began to stagger under the unexpected intensity of the charge. Machine guns, previously designed to hold the enemy at bay, were now being used as support fire from the advancing Marines, cutting down those who attempted to regroup. Artillery crews, previously positioned behind the ridge, fired in rapid, sweeping bursts, adding fragmentation and smoke to the melee. Private Lewis, who had whispered in fear just hours before, later recalled the sensory overload of that moment. "It was like the world narrowed," he said. "All I could see were the men in front of me, the ones beside me, and the ones trying to reach us. Everything else, artillery, gunfire, the screaming, it all became background noise. You moved, you struck, you surveyed." By the 5th minute, the Japanese assault began to crumble. Their numerical superiority, which had seemed so overwhelming only moments before, now worked against them. Dense formations became choke points. Men blocked each other's retreat. Commanders shouted orders, but the Americans' audacity had disrupted the chain of command. Soldiers who had expected to reach the ridge with certainty now hesitated, exposed to the devastating combination of frontal bayonet assault and supporting fire from positions the Marines had vacated only moments before. Hollingsworth noticed an opportunity. He led a flanking maneuver, signaling 2 squads to sweep around the eastern ridge where the terrain formed a natural bottleneck. The movement was precise. One squad engaged directly, tying down enemy combatants, while the other struck at their exposed flank. Within minutes, the Japanese lines began to fracture. Confusion spread faster than bullets. Men turned back toward the rear, some surrendering, others fleeing into the hills. 12 minutes after the order to charge, the ridge was secured. 3,000 attackers had been neutralized, not through overwhelming firepower alone, but through the audacity of a coordinated, disciplined bayonet assault executed with timing, precision, and a psychological understanding of the enemy. Casualty reports would later confirm that several hundred Japanese soldiers were killed or wounded, while the Marines suffered comparatively light losses, fewer than 20 men killed and 50 wounded. What made this engagement extraordinary?
was not just the numbers, but the inversion of expectation. Military doctrine of 1945 dictated that the defense against massed infantry relied on firepower, entrenched positions, and delaying tactics. A bayonet charge of this scale against an enemy outnumbering your own was considered suicidal. Yet the Marines had turned doctrine on its head, exploiting both terrain and human psychology to achieve the impossible. Eyewitness accounts, compiled in post-war interviews and official after-action reports, emphasized the psychological weight of the moment. One Japanese officer, captured days later, admitted, "We expected guns, traps, and fire. We did not expect men to run at us, with knives and courage. In that instant, it was as if our training had vanished." For the Marines, the lesson was equally profound. The rigidity of doctrine, the reliance on firepower, was insufficient in certain conditions. Adaptation, audacity, and cohesion could produce results that theory alone could never predict. Material reality reinforced the lesson. Ammunition conservation had been critical in the lead-up to the engagement. Every round saved was a potential life preserved. The bayonet, long considered a secondary weapon, became the principal tool for survival. Terrain, previously thought to favor defensive fire, became an advantage when leveraged for mobility and surprise. In 12 minutes, the Marines demonstrated that doctrine could be rewritten in real time, and that human initiative could bend the seeming inevitability of numbers and firepower. The aftermath of the charge was immediate and profound. The ridge became a symbol of American resolve in the Okinawa campaign. For the surviving Japanese, the failed assault undermined morale and disrupted command cohesion across the sector. For the Marines, the victory reinforced the importance of training, psychological insight, and the willingness to execute high-risk maneuvers when conventional options were exhausted. Lieutenant Hollingsworth's report to regimental command emphasized both the tactical success and the psychological dimension. The enemy expected suppression and delay. They did not expect courage, cohesion, and aggression in such concentration. In 12 minutes, we shattered a formation 3,000 strong, not by firepower alone, but by audacity and discipline. This is a lesson that doctrine alone cannot teach. This event, while small in the scale of the Pacific War, captured the paradox at the heart of human combat. The impossible is often only so because no one has yet tried it. The Marines had done more than repel an assault. They had demonstrated a fundamental truth of warfare and human behavior. Numbers, firepower, and doctrine are only part of the equation. Psychological insight, cohesion, and decisive action can overturn expectations that appear immutable. The ridge, now quiet except for the moans of the wounded and the distant rumble of artillery, bore witness to a paradoxical truth. The impossible had been achieved. Lieutenant Hollingsworth stood surveying the scene. The sweat and grime of combat streaked across his face, his uniform torn in places where Japanese bayonets had found purchase but failed to halt him. Around him, the surviving Marines moved to tend the wounded, collect the dead, and reorganize their positions. The immediate aftermath was both practical and psychological. Casualty reports confirmed the staggering efficiency of the assault. Fewer than 20 Marines had been killed, while the Japanese suffered several hundred dead or incapacitated. Equipment was retrieved where possible, though many rifles and bayonets had been broken in the melee. Ammunition supplies, preserved by the decision to engage with bayonets at close range, remained sufficient for anticipated follow-on operations. What was perhaps more profound, however, was the effect on morale. For the Marines, witnessing a force 3,000 strong crumble under a coordinated bayonet assault shattered deeply ingrained assumptions about the relationship between numbers, firepower, and outcome. Soldiers who had doubted their ability to hold the ridge now understood that initiative, discipline, and audacity could transform even the direst circumstances into victory. In the weeks that followed, reports and debriefings emphasized this psychological shift. Officers at regimental and divisional levels took careful note. Small unit initiative could alter the course of engagements previously considered dictated by overwhelming enemy numbers. For the Japanese, the shock was equally profound. Those who survived the failed assault reported that their perception of invincibility had been broken in moments. Decades of indoctrination, cultivated through Bushido teachings, propaganda leaflets, and officer-led exhortations, had conditioned soldiers to believe that discipline and sheer aggression could always overcome adversity. The bayonet charge at Shuri Ridge demonstrated that doctrine alone could be outmaneuvered, and that human ingenuity and audacity could rewrite expectations in the heat of battle. The human dimension of the engagement also illuminates the broader reality of World War II combat. Fatigue, hunger, and psychological strain were omnipresent, shaping the decisions of both attackers and defenders. The Marines' ability to integrate these factors into effective action underscores the central paradox of the battle. Preparation and doctrine are necessary, but they are insufficient without adaptability, courage, and coordination under pressure. In the months following Okinawa, the story of the bayonet charge spread quietly through military channels. It was not celebrated with fanfare, for the scale of the Pacific War demanded attention on larger strategic operations. Okinawa itself, the firebombing of Japanese cities, the impending invasion of the home islands. Yet within professional circles, the engagement became a reference point for teaching small unit initiative, leadership under stress, and the psychological impact of audacity. Officers studying the battle emphasized that the conditions which made the charge successful, a combination of terrain, enemy exhaustion, surprise, and coordinated aggression, were replicable principles rather than random luck. Lieutenant Hollingsworth, in his post-war reflections, often returned to the central paradox of that day. "We were supposed to be outnumbered, outgunned, and overwhelmed," he wrote in a memoir compiled in 1953. And yet in 12 minutes, we had broken a force 3,000 strong. It was not luck. It was training. It was discipline. And it was the willingness to act when everything told us not to. That is a lesson that stays with you longer than the pain or the fear. The legacy of that engagement also rippled beyond military circles. It demonstrated the potency of human initiative against apparent inevitability, offering a lesson applicable to both warfare and broader human endeavors. The impossible charge at Shuri Ridge remains a case study in the interplay between doctrine and reality, demonstrating that even in the most extreme conditions, human resolve and ingenuity can defy expectation. Ultimately, the battle underscores a profound truth of history. The metrics of war, numbers, equipment, and strategy are essential, but the decisive variable often remains the human element. Courage, coordination, and the ability to perceive and exploit moments of opportunity can overturn assumptions that seem unassailable. In the case of Shuri Ridge, 12 minutes and a few dozen men redefined the possible, leaving a mark on military history that persists not in grandiose claims of conquest, but in the quiet, enduring reality of what disciplined, determined humans can achieve when doctrine meets audacity. The ridge would later be described in official reports as a tactical anomaly, a rare and almost unbelievable moment in the midst of a campaign dominated by attrition, artillery, and the grinding calculus of numerical superiority. In those reports, military analysts carefully cataloged the precise combination of factors that made the engagement extraordinary. The disciplined training of the Marines, the unique features of the terrain, the unexpected timing of the assault, and the psychological state of the Japanese attackers. Each factor alone might have been insufficient to produce such a decisive outcome. Together they converged in a fleeting moment of clarity and daring that allowed a small force, acting with cohesion and courage, to shatter what, on paper, should have been an insurmountable obstacle. For the Marines who survived that day, the battle became a touchstone, a moment they would recall for the rest of their lives with a mixture of awe, pride, and the lingering weight of those they had lost. Sergeant Harold Hap Thompson, who had led a squad along the eastern flank of the ridge, would later describe it in letters to his family as a surreal experience. It was chaos, but it was organized chaos, he wrote. Every man knew his part, every step was measured, every thrust counted. I do not think any of us believed we would survive, but we moved because we had to, because hesitation would have meant death. Thompson's reflections, preserved in the archives of the Pacific Theater Historical Association, underscore a central truth of the engagement. Survival was inseparable from disciplined action. Fear was present, palpable, but it was harnessed, converted into focus and execution rather than paralyzing indecision. Similarly, Private Lewis, barely 21 and fresh from training on the Hawaiian Islands, recounted in a post-war interview that the charge felt, in the moment, almost detached from the larger war. The world narrowed to the men around me and the ridge in front of us. All else, the artillery, the shouts, the smoke, faded. You could only see what was necessary to survive. Every step, every strike, every movement had to be precise. There was no room for doubt. These personal memoirs provide a window into the human experience of the engagement, highlighting how the constraints of physical reality, fatigue, heat, dehydration, and the sensory overload of combat, intersected with tactical discipline to produce what appeared, from a distance, as a miraculous outcome. The Japanese soldiers, for their part, experienced the psychological weight of the encounter in a profoundly different manner. Accustomed to rigid hierarchies and disciplined formations, many were bewildered by the audacity of the American assault. Eyewitness accounts collected from prisoners and post-war interrogations reveal a recurring theme: shock, confusion, and disbelief. One captured officer, speaking to U.S. intelligence shortly after the engagement, admitted, "We expected fire and barriers, machine guns and mortars. We did not expect men to run at us with knives and determination, as if death were not possible. For the first time, I felt our training meant nothing. The Americans did not fight as soldiers. They fought as something more, something untouchable." This psychological dimension is as significant as the material outcome. The disruption of the Japanese assault cannot be attributed solely to firepower or the terrain. It was the human element, the courage, initiative, and audacity of the Marines that altered the calculus of combat. Military doctrine of the time emphasized entrenched positions, suppressive fire, and numerical advantage. Bayonet charges, especially against a force vastly larger and seemingly well-prepared, were considered suicidal and nearly obsolete in modern warfare. Yet the Marines demonstrated that doctrine is, at times, secondary to human ingenuity. Their actions revealed the fragility of assumptions, the limitations of rigid military thinking, and the enduring importance of morale and psychological dominance in combat. From a material perspective, the Ridge offers a case study in the interaction between terrain and tactical innovation. Shuri Ridge itself was characterized by shallow slopes, dense brush, and pockets of natural cover, features that, at first glance, appeared to favor the defenders. Japanese doctrine, grounded in principles of entrenchment and massed fire, assumed that attacking forces would be funneled into predictable kill zones, where overlapping fields of fire could inflict maximum casualties. The Marines, however, leveraged these same features in ways that the Japanese had not anticipated. Squads moved along depressions and gullies, approaching under partial concealment, while synchronized flanking maneuvers exploited gaps in enemy formations. Each step was calculated to disrupt cohesion, not merely to kill. By combining movement, terrain awareness, and discipline coordination, the Marines converted a perceived disadvantage into a force multiplier, demonstrating that the battlefield is as much a domain of cognition and planning as of firepower. The integration of human factors, training, psychology, and leadership, was equally critical. Lieutenant Hollingsworth, who had studied small unit tactics extensively, recognized that conventional defensive doctrine could be inverted through audacity and coordination. His leadership emphasized initiative at the squad level. Each Marine was empowered to act decisively within the framework of a larger plan. This decentralization of decision-making, when combined with rigorous pre-battle preparation, created a unit capable of rapid adaptation under extreme stress. The outcome of the engagement illustrates a broader principle of warfare. When well-trained, disciplined, and psychologically prepared individuals confront uncertainty, they can transcend the limitations imposed by numbers and equipment. The legacy of the Shuri Ridge charge extends beyond immediate tactical lessons. For historians of the Pacific Theater, it serves as a microcosm of the human dimension of warfare, illustrating how relatively small units can exert disproportionate influence on the battlefield through a combination of planning, courage, and psychological insight. The engagement challenges the conventional narrative that victory is solely determined by firepower, technology, or numerical superiority. Instead, it underscores the interplay of human initiative, situational awareness, and adaptability. As such, the Ridge represents not merely a tactical anomaly, but a philosophical statement about the nature of combat, that the boundaries of the possible are often constrained less by material realities than by the limitations of belief and imagination. In post-war military education, the engagement became a case study in small unit leadership and the psychological components of combat effectiveness. Officers studying Shuri Ridge emphasized several recurring themes: the importance of initiative at all levels of command, the necessity of integrating terrain analysis into tactical planning, the value of coordinated aggression in disrupting enemy formations, and the interplay between physical action and psychological effect. The Ridge, in these analyses, exemplifies how disciplined human action can create outcomes that appear at first glance impossible. It became a touchstone for teaching that doctrine must be flexible, and that courage, initiative, and psychological acuity are as decisive as firepower. Tear assumptions and produce results that appear miraculous when viewed from conventional frameworks. The engagement remains a potent reminder that human agency, even in the most extreme circumstances, retains the power to redefine what is possible. For the Marines themselves, the Ridge was more than a lesson in tactics. It was a defining moment in collective identity. Survivors carried the memory as a demonstration of what could be achieved when fear is transformed into resolve, when preparation meets opportunity, and when humans act decisively in the face of overwhelming odds. Letters, memoirs, and oral histories recount the pride and awe with which they recalled the moment, tempered by the sobering reality of those who had been lost. The engagement created a shared understanding of what discipline, cohesion, and audacity could achieve, shaping the ethos of units for the remainder of the campaign and beyond. The Japanese survivors, meanwhile, interpreted the engagement differently, but with equal clarity about its significance. Their accounts reveal a profound sense of disorientation and a re-evaluation of assumptions regarding American combat capability. Where doctrine had promised control through order, the reality was chaos imposed by human initiative. Where numbers had promised inevitability, audacity and cohesion had produced reversal. In these reflections, the battle transcends its immediate tactical outcome, offering insights into how combatants perceive power, threat, and the unexpected. In the broader sweep of history, Shuri Ridge illustrates a fundamental principle. The limits of the possible are rarely fixed. They are contingent upon human perception, decision-making, and action. 12 minutes of disciplined, coordinated aggression produced results that, before the engagement, would have been dismissed as unthinkable. Yet the Marines' success was neither random nor miraculous. It was the product of rigorous training, careful planning,
psychological insight, and the willingness to act decisively in the face of overwhelming odds. In this sense, the ridge stands not only as a symbol of tactical brilliance, but as a timeless lesson about the human capacity to transcend apparent constraints. In reflecting on the charge decades later, military historians,
veterans and scholars alike converge on a singular insight. Shuri Ridge exemplifies the dynamic interplay between doctrine and improvisation, between expectation and reality, between fear and resolve. It is a moment when human initiative imposed its own logic upon a chaotic battlefield, demonstrating that the boundaries of the possible are, at their core, human constructs, reshaped by courage, creativity, and audacity. The legacy of that brief 12-minute engagement endures because it illuminates a truth as relevant to the study of warfare as it is to the understanding of human potential in extreme circumstances. That even in situations that seem utterly constrained, the decisive variable is often the human will to act. The ridge's historical significance lies less in strategic scale than in the lessons it imparts about human behavior, leadership, and the psychology of combat. It reminds us that even when facing overwhelming force, the combination of initiative, discipline, and audacity can produce outcomes previously deemed impossible. For the Marines, the ridge became a touchstone of identity and capability. For the Japanese, it revealed the fragility of assumption and expectation. For historians, it serves as a case study in the interplay between doctrine, psychology, and human agency. And for anyone studying the nature of conflict, courage, or leadership, the lesson of Shuri Ridge is unequivocal. The boundaries of the possible are determined not solely by circumstance, but by the human willingness to confront, endure, and act decisively when all else seems lost. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.